The medical bay of the GSV Ardent Reach smelled like filtered air and antiseptic foam. Reed Holt was on his back under a life support console, tightening a loose coupling with a hand tool when he first heard her. Not her voice, her work. The sound of data slates being sorted, one after another. Precise, rhythmic, like someone who had made peace with doing everything from a single position. He slid out from under the console and saw her. She was seated in a gravity-assist cradle near the far wall, 6 limbs total, which was normal for a Vithrani. The upper 2 were moving, handling slates with quiet efficiency. The lower 4 were arranged beneath her, folded neatly, completely still. Not resting still, wrong still, the kind of still that does not change. Her exoskeleton carried pale blue bioluminescent markings along the joint lines of her upper arms. They pulsed faintly when she moved. When she reached, they brightened. When she set a slate down, they dimmed again. It was like watching someone speak in a language made of light. Reed finished his check, packed his kit, and left without saying anything. He came back the next morning because the biomonitor relay in the same bay needed a firmware update. He told himself that was the only reason. She was in the same cradle, different slates, same stillness in the lower half of her body. Dr. Finn was at his desk on the other side of the room, reviewing patient files. Finn was Yulari, tall and gray-feathered, with the calm eyes of someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. Reed asked him about the console near the wall, the one beside the cradle, and whether the calibration logs were current. Finn told him the logs were fine. Then, without Reed asking, Finn said quietly, "Her name is Sova. She was the primary cultural liaison for the Ardent Reach before the accident." Reed kept his eyes on the console. What happened? Debris collapse on Vithra Station. A support structure failed during an evacuation. She was helping others move when the ceiling section came down. Finn paused. The impact caused neural compression in her mid-thorax nerve cluster. For a Vithrani, that cluster controls the lower 4 limbs entirely. Can it be repaired? Finn's feather crest settled flat, which Reed had learned meant something between resignation and sorrow. Not with anything we have. Vithrani neural architecture is very different from the species our medical database was designed around. There is no approved prosthetic interface for her limb type, no surgical protocol. She has been evaluated by 3 council-certified physicians. They all said the same thing. Reed looked over at her. She was still working. She had not looked up once during the conversation. How long has she been like this? 14 months, Finn said. Reed nodded slowly, picked up his kit and left. That evening he sat in his bunk in the engineering quarters and opened his personal terminal. He pulled up everything in the public database on Vithrani biology, skeletal structure, exoskeletal joint mechanics, nerve fiber density maps, bioluminescent signal pathways. Ren, his AI assistant built into the engineering toolkit, noticed the search pattern and spoke up from the terminal speaker. "You're reading Vithrani anatomy files." "Yes," Reed said. "That's not in your maintenance schedule." "I know." A short pause. "Should I be concerned?" "Not yet." He read until the ship's lights cycled to dim. The files were dense and full of terminology he had to look up. Vithrani joint articulation was nothing like humanoid mechanics. Their exoskeletal frame was rigid in some areas and surprisingly flexible in others. The lower limb joints operated on a multi-axis pivot system that no existing prosthetic technology had ever been built around. Every file he opened confirmed what Finn had said. There was no existing solution, no template, no tested design. Nothing in the Galactic Council's entire medical catalog addressed this specific combination of species, injury type, and limb count. He closed the terminal late and lay in the dark for a while. He thought about the way her upper arms moved when she worked, the bioluminescent markings brightening with each reach, dimming with each pause. Her hands never hesitated. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it from a fixed point in space because that was what she had. He thought about the lower four limbs, folded and still beneath her. He thought about what it would mean to design not for a species, but for a specific person, for the exact signal patterns of one individual, mapped and measured and built around. He did not sleep much. In the morning, before his shift began, he went back to the terminal and opened a new file. Not a medical file this time, an engineering file. He typed 3 words at the top of the blank page and stared at them. Start from scratch. Then he started writing. The problem was not that the technology didn't exist. The problem was that no one had ever needed to build it before. Reed spent 3 days reading before he said a word to anyone. He read about exoskeletal stress tolerances, about bioelectrical signal conduction in insectoid nerve fibers, about the way Vethrani lower limbs distributed weight across a 6-point stance. He filled a personal notebook with rough sketches and bad ideas and questions he didn't have answers to yet. On the 4th day, he went to Dr. Fenn. He laid it out simply. Not a neural prosthetic, not surgery. Those roads were closed and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. What he was proposing was different. An external frame. A mechanical structure that would attach to Sova's lower exoskeleton and move her limbs for her. Not by connecting to her damaged nerve cluster, but by reading the residual bioelectrical signals from her upper body and translating them into movement commands. Her upper arms still worked. Her upper torso still produced signals. If those signals could be read and interpreted, they could be used to tell a machine what her lower limbs should do. Fenn listened without interrupting. When Reed finished, the Yulari physician was quiet for a long moment. The tolerance requirements would be very precise, Fenn said carefully. Vethrani joint articulation points are not simple hinges. They move on multiple axes. If your frame applies even slightly too much pressure on the wrong axis, it could fracture the surrounding exoskeletal casing. I know, Reed said. That's why I need accurate measurements, full joint mapping, range of motion data, everything you have. Fenn studied him. You understand that if this injures her further, the consequences will be serious. I understand. Why are you doing this? Reed considered the question honestly. Because the problem exists and I have the tools to try, that's enough reason. Fenn looked at him for another moment, then nodded. I will arrange a meeting. The meeting happened the following afternoon in the medical bay. Sova was in her cradle when Reed arrived. She looked at him with the flat, patient expression of someone who had been looked at with pity many times and had learned to wait it out. Reed sat down across from her, not beside her, and did not look at her lower limbs at all. I'm Reed Holt, he said. I work in engineering. I know who you are, Sova said. Her translator rendered her voice as low and even. Dr. Fenn told me you have been reading Vethrani anatomy files for several days. Yes. He also told me you have a proposal. I do, but I want to be clear about something first. He met her eyes, which were large and multifaceted, the deep amber color of old resin. I am not going to promise you anything. I don't know if this will work. I have a direction and I have some ideas and I will work on them seriously. That is all I can honestly tell you. One of her upper arms shifted slightly. The bioluminescent marking at her elbow joint brightened for just a moment. That, she said, is the first honest thing anyone has said to me in 14 months. She let him take the measurements. It took 2 hours. Reed used a contact sensor array borrowed from Fenn's equipment to map the joint geometry of all 4 lower limbs. He recorded the range of motion in each axis, the thickness of the exoskeletal casing at each stress point, the spacing between joints. Sova sat still through all of it. She asked technical questions occasionally, smart ones, and Reed answered them directly. When he was done, he thanked her and left. Back in the engineering bay, he He spread everything across his work table and stared at it. Ren processed the numbers in the background, running initial stress models. The joint geometry is more complex than standard actuator systems can handle cleanly, Ren said. You would need custom brackets at every pivot point, custom printed, fitted to her specifically. I know. The biosignal reader is also a problem. Standard humanoid signal interfaces read a different frequency band than V-Thrani nerve tissue. I know that too. So you'll need to build a custom reader as well. Yes. A pause. This is going to take a while. Probably, Reed said. He picked up a stylus and started sketching the first bracket design. Let's start with the knee analog joint on the front left limb. Give me the stress load numbers. Ren gave him the numbers. Reed drew and erased and drew again. Outside the porthole beside his workbench, the stars held still, indifferent and very far away. Inside the small, warm space of the engineering bay, a human worked on a problem that had never been solved before, with no guarantee that it ever would be, simply because the problem was there, and the person it belonged to deserved better than an empty answer. He worked until well past midnight. Then he set his stylus down, looked at what he had, and decided it was a start. The first frame collapsed in 17 seconds. Reed had not expected it to work. He had built it quickly, from salvaged drone struts and spare actuator parts, just to see where the weak points were. He found them. The central load bar buckled under the simulated weight distribution because he had misjudged how a V-Thrani's mass shifted across all 4 lower limbs during a forward step. On a biped, weight transfer was simple. On a 6-limbed exoskeletal being, it was a completely different calculation. He took the collapsed frame apart, noted everything that failed, and started the second design. The second frame held its shape but bound at the knee analog joints during the movement test. The custom brackets were too tight on the inner pivot axis. The limbs could extend forward but could not complete the return arc without jamming. Reed spent a full day adjusting tolerances, printed new brackets, tested again. Still binding. He scrapped it. The third frame showed real promise. The joints moved freely, the load bar held, and the overall structure was lighter than the first 2. But when he ran the biosignal reader test using a synthetic signal source set to V-Thrani frequency ranges, the reader kept misidentifying voluntary movement signals as involuntary muscle tremor. It would filter them out before they ever reached the movement processor. Ren ran the diagnostic 3 times to confirm. The problem is that Sova's upper body signals are quieter than the standard V-Thrani baseline, Ren said. 14 months of reduced mobility. Her upper limbs are strong, but her thorax signals have attenuated. The reader is treating them as background noise. Reed sat back and thought about that for a long time. He had been building toward a general V-Thrani solution, a frame that would work for the species, calibrated to standard parameters. That was the wrong approach. There was no standard here. There was only Sova, her specific signal patterns, her specific joint geometry, her specific way of moving in the space she still had. He threw out the generic calibration profile entirely and started building a reader tuned exclusively to the signal data he had collected from her directly. Not a species template, a personal one. It took 4 more days. During those 4 days, Captain Lara called him in. She was a tall V-Thrani, older than Sova, with darker markings and the careful stillness of someone used to command. She did not waste time. Dr. Fenn tells me you are building an unsanctioned medical device in the engineering bay, she said. A mechanical frame, Reed said. Not a medical device technically, more of an assistive structure. The distinction may not protect you if something goes wrong. I know. Olara studied him the way she probably studied navigational hazards, careful, thorough, looking for the thing that would cause the problem. Sova is one of the finest crew members I have ever served with. She was already extraordinary before the accident. If your device injures her further, I will hold you fully accountable. That's fair, Reed said. Olara was quiet for a moment. Then, in a slightly different tone, she said, "Is it going to work?" "I don't know yet. I think the direction is right. The details are hard." She dismissed him without another word. He went back to the engineering bay and finished the new signal reader. The fourth test run changed everything. With a calibration profile built entirely from Sova's own data, the reader stopped filtering out her signals. It caught them cleanly. Upper arm extension, thorax lean, shoulder rotation. Every movement produced a distinct, readable output. Ren mapped each signal to a corresponding lower limb action. Forward lean meant step. Arm extension direction suggested which limbs led. Shoulder dip indicated turning intent. It wasn't how a Vithrani naturally walked. It was how Sova moved when she was working, reaching, thinking. The frame would not restore what she had lost. It would build something new around what she still had. Reed ran the simulation 40 times. 40 times the virtual lower limbs completed a full walking cycle without jamming, without collapsing, without misreading the signal source. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. Ren spoke quietly, ready to request a fitting. Reed looked at the frame sitting on the work table. It wasn't beautiful. It was angular and functional and built from parts that had been other things before. But every joint bracket was fitted to exact measurements. Every load tolerance was calculated for one specific body. Every signal threshold was tuned to one specific person. "Yes," he said, "send the request to Dr. Fenn." He didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't from worry. It was from something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something real, looking down, and deciding to take the next step anyway. Sova arrived at the medical bay on time, which Reed was learning was simply how she did everything. She was in her gravity-assist cradle, moved there by the ship's internal transport system, and she watched Reed unpack the frame from its case with the same careful, measuring look she gave data slates. Not hopeful, not dismissive, just watching and waiting to see what the evidence would say. Dr. Fenn stood at his monitoring station nearby, bioscanner active, feather crest held low and still. He had reviewed Reed's design files the night before and had spent 2 hours asking precise questions that Reed had answered as honestly as he could. Fenn had said at the end of it that he thought the approach was sound. It was the closest thing to an endorsement Reed was going to get, and it was enough. Reed set the frame pieces out in order and explained each one as he went. This central bar runs along your lower thorax and distributes the load across all 4 limb mounts. It doesn't attach to your exoskeleton directly. It uses contact clamps that fit around the joint casings without penetrating them. If something goes wrong and you need it off, pull the release tab here and the whole thing separates in under 2 seconds. Sova looked at the release tab. "Show me." He showed her. She made him show her twice more, then practiced it herself with one upper arm until she could do it without looking. "Continue," she said. He walked her through the rest. The signal reader pads that would rest against her upper thorax and shoulder joints. The thin wire routing that connected them to the central processor mounted on the load bar. The joint actuators at each limb pivot, small and precise, that would do the actual work of moving. She asked good questions throughout. How much does the processor lag between signal and movement? Less than 40 milliseconds, he said. What happens if the signal reader loses contact? The frame stops and holds position. It does not fall. Does the frame add weight to her lower limbs? Yes, about 3 kilograms distributed across 4 attachment points. When he had finished explaining, she said simply, "Put it on." The fitting took just under an hour. Each piece had to be seated carefully, the clamps adjusted to sit firm without pressing too hard on the joint casings. Reed worked slowly and checked each contact point against the measurements he had taken weeks earlier. Sova sat still through all of it and did not make a sound. When the last connection was made, and the processor light on the load bar turned from red to amber, Reed stepped back. "Ren," he said quietly, "start calibration." The AI's voice came from the small speaker clipped to Reed's collar. "Running signal acquisition. Hold still, please." Sova held still. The processor light pulsed slowly. Fenn's scanner hummed. After 90 seconds, Ren said, "Signal acquisition complete. All 4 limb actuators responding. Running pre-movement check." The lower limbs shifted. Small movements, just the actuators testing their range, each joint flexing slightly and returning. Sova's upper arms tensed when she saw it. The bioluminescent markings along her elbows flared bright for just a moment. "Calibration complete," Ren said. "Frame is ready." Reed looked at Sova. "When you're ready, lean forward slightly and let your upper body lead like you're going to reach for something." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked straight ahead at the open floor of the medical bay. She leaned forward. The lower limbs moved, all 4 of them, 2 stepping forward in sequence with the other 2 bracing and following. The motion was not smooth. It was mechanical and deliberate, each step slightly slower than natural. But it was a step, and then another. Sova stood fully upright on all 6 limbs for the first time in 14 months. The medical bay was completely silent. Fenn's feather crest rose straight up and then slowly settled. He made no sound. His eyes were very bright. Reed did not move. He stood with his hands at his sides and watched. Sova took a 3rd step, a 4th. She moved across the floor of the medical bay in a slow, careful arc, the frame working with each lean and shift of her upper body, the actuators responding, the processor keeping pace. She reached the far wall and stopped. She stood there with her back to them for a moment. When she turned around, Reed could not read her face the way he could read a human face. Vithrani expressions were subtle and carried in the light patterns of their markings more than in features. But the markings across her upper arms and thorax were blazing. Every line was bright, brighter than he had seen them, steady and full. She walked back toward him. 4 steps 6, 8. She stopped in front of him, and he saw that she was holding herself very still in the upper body, which he now understood meant she was working hard to stay composed. She said only 2 words. "Again," she said, "again." And Reed reset the calibration, and she walked again, and then again after that, and Dr. Fenn stopped pretending to look at his scanner and just stood there and watched the 2 of them in the quiet medical bay, the human and the Vithrani, until the ship's lights cycled toward evening. The sessions became part of the ship's rhythm. Every morning before the first duty shift, Sova came to the medical bay and worked with the frame for an hour. Reed was there for the first week, adjusting the calibration after each session, tuning small things. The signal reader sensitivity on her left shoulder was slightly off. He corrected it. One of the front limb actuators was building micro-resistance over time. He replaced the drive component. Each day the frame responded a little more cleanly, and each day Sova moved with a little more certainty. She stopped needing the gravity-assist cradle for transport by the 5th day. She walked herself to the medical bay. The crew of the Ardent Reach noticed. The first time Sova moved through the main corridor under her own power, 2 Vithrani crew members stopped walking entirely. They stood against the wall and held very still with their upper arms tucked in and their heads lowered. Reed, walking a few steps behind with his toolkit, had no idea what it meant until Fenn explained it later. It was a gesture of witnessing. In Vithrani culture, when you saw something that changed the shape of what you believed was possible, you stopped and you held still and you let it pass through you. Reed thought about that for the rest of the day. Sova said nothing about these moments. She walked through them and kept working. She had returned to partial duty by the end of the 2nd week. She could not yet attend all the physical meetings her liaison role required, but she was handling all communications, all translation work, and all cultural briefings from her station. The Ardent Reach was approaching a contact situation with a newly registered species called the Dolhari, and Sova had been preparing for that contact for months before her accident. She knew the preliminary data better than anyone on the ship. Captain Lara quietly reinstated her to full liaison status on the 14th day. She did not make an announcement about it. She simply updated the crew manifest and sent Sova a one-line message. Sova sent back a one-line reply. Reed heard about it from Finn, who seemed quietly moved by the whole exchange in the way that calm people get moved when they are careful not to show it. Then the council letter arrived. It came through official channels. The Galactic Medical Council's Compliance Division had flagged an unsanctioned assistive device in use aboard a registered council vessel. The letter was formal and precise, and it requested a full accounting of the device's design, testing history, and authorization pathway, with a note that use of unauthorized medical equipment by non-certified personnel was subject to review and possible censure. Reed read it twice and then set it down. Before he could begin drafting any response, Sova appeared in the engineering bay doorway. She was standing straight on all 6 limbs, her upper arms relaxed at her sides. The bioluminescent markings along her joints were calm and even. "I have seen the letter," she said. "I was going to respond this evening," Reed said. "You are not going to respond," she said. "I am." He started to say something and she stopped him with a small, precise gesture of one upper arm. "This is my domain. Compliance correspondence, institutional communication, official response. This is what I do. You build things. Let me do what I do." He sat back and said nothing. She recorded her response to the council that same afternoon. Reed never saw the full text of it. What he heard from Fenn was that it was measured and completely devastating. She had documented, point by point, what the council's certified physicians had offered her, which was a series of evaluations concluding that nothing could be done. She had documented what an uncertified human engineer had built in a small workshop using salvaged components and publicly available anatomy data. She had then asked the council to clarify which of these 2 outcomes better served the organization's stated mission of supporting all registered species aboard council vessels. She had not been angry, she had simply been precise. The council's compliance division did not respond. 3 days later, the compliance flag on the device registry was quietly removed. Reed found out when Wren flagged the update in the ship's official log. He read it once, set down his tools, and sat quietly for a moment. That same evening, when he returned to the engineering bay after the late shift meal, there was a data slate on his workbench. He had not left it there. He picked it up. On it was a single line of text in Vithrani script. He did not read Vithrani. He took a photo of it and sent it to Wren. Wren translated it in seconds, and read the result aloud in the flat, dry tone that was simply how Wren spoke. "You saw me." Reed set the slate down carefully. He stood at his workbench for a long time without doing anything. Outside the porthole, the star field moved slowly as the ship adjusted course. The engineering bay was warm and quiet. He picked the slate back up and put it in his kit, in the inner pocket where he kept things he wanted to keep. Then he got back to work, because tomorrow's session would need a new calibration check on the right rear limb actuator, and Sova would show up exactly on time, and he intended to be ready. The Dolhari delegation came aboard on a Tuesday. There were 4 of them, short and wide-shouldered, with dense gray skin and small dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging everything. They had never set foot on a Galactic Council vessel before. They had never formally met more than 2 alien species at once. Their own planet had achieved faster-than-light travel only 11 years ago, and the universe was still, by all evidence, overwhelming them in the best possible way. Captain Lara received them in the main corridor with the formal Vithrani greeting, which involved a precise arrangement of all 6 limbs and a specific tilt of the head. The Dolhari watched this with enormous concentration, clearly filing it away. Then Sova walked in. She came from the direction of the bridge corridor, moving at her regular pace, all 6 limbs working in the steady, deliberate rhythm that Reed had spent weeks refining with her. The frame was visible, it didn't hide, and she had never wanted it to. The actuators caught the corridor light as she moved. The bioluminescent markings along her upper arms pulsed calmly with each step. The 4 Dolhari went completely still. Their eyes, which had been moving constantly since they came aboard, stopped. Sova walked to the center of the reception area, stopped in front of the delegation, and began the formal introduction in the Dolhari primary language, which she had been studying from the preliminary contact recordings for 3 months. Her pronunciation was careful and correct. The lead Dolhari delegate's jaw moved slightly in what the contact files identified as a sign of surprise. After the introduction, the lead delegate looked at the frame on Sova's lower limbs and spoke a question. Sova translated it herself for the room. "She wants to know what the structure is," Sova said. "She says it looks like a machine that learned how to be part of a person." There was a brief silence. Olara looked at Reed, who was standing at the side of the room in his usual position, near the wall, out of the way. He had not expected to be looked at. Sova answered the delegate directly, and then translated her own answer for the room's benefit. "I told her that a human built it, that there was a problem no one had solved before, and a human decided that was not a permanent situation. That is what humans do when they encounter a problem. They look at what they have and they build toward what is needed." The lead Dolhari delegate looked across the room at Reed. Reed nodded once, which was apparently enough, because she nodded back in the same way and then returned her attention to Sova. The reception continued. Reed stayed by the wall. After the delegation had been escorted to their quarters and the formal session had closed, Olara crossed the room to where Reed was still standing. She stopped in front of him and looked at him for a moment with the same careful, navigational hazard expression she had used in her office weeks ago. Then she raised one upper arm and placed it briefly against his shoulder. A light touch, just a second. He had no idea what it meant. She walked away without explaining it. Later, Fen found him in the corridor and told him. Among the Vithrani, that gesture was given to someone who had changed the shape of what you believed the world could hold. It was not given often. It was not given lightly. It meant, in the most direct translation Fen could offer, you are part of something now. Reed stood in the corridor and sat with that for a while. He found Sova in the engineering bay an hour later. She had come in without announcement, which she had apparently decided was acceptable at some point, and she was running a calibration check on the frame herself. Her upper arms moved precisely through the sequence he had taught her, checking each contact point, reviewing the processor readout on the small panel at the load bar. She had learned the whole maintenance routine on her own. He leaned in the doorway and watched without saying anything. After a moment she said, without turning around, "The right rear actuator has a new micro-resistance pattern, 3% above baseline. It should be replaced before it degrades further." "I'll order the part tonight," he said. "I already submitted the parts request," she said. "It should arrive with the next supply delivery." He looked at her. She finished the check and then turned around, and her markings were doing the quiet, even pulse they did when she was focused and calm and entirely herself. "You are going to make yourself impossible to need," he said. "That," she said, "is exactly the point." He laughed. It came out before he could stop it. A short, genuine sound, and Sova's upper arms shifted in what Fen had once told him was a Vithrani expression of satisfaction. That was the whole of it. No speech, no ceremony, Just a human standing in a doorway and a Vithrani running her own calibration check in a warm, quiet engineering bay while the stars moved past the porthole and the ship carried them forward. Later, back at his bunk, Reed wrote a single line in his engineering notebook under the frame's project file. Built for one, worked because of her. From the terminal, Wren spoke without being asked. For the record, Wren said, I did all the math. You just refused to believe it was impossible. Reed thought about it. Yeah, he said, that's about right. He closed the notebook, turned off the light, and for the first time in a long time slept.